Hi, welcome back to Pugs Tea and the Paranormal, where we dive into a true scary story over a good cup of tea. And of course, we have two of the cutest little pugs to keep us company while we do it. I'm Leah, and right here is Hootie Bear, and next to him is his little brother, Dexter. So today, with all of the drone sightings that have been going on, I only thought it appropriate to talk about an alien case, and this should be pretty fun because this is actually one of Canada's biggest and most documented UFO cases. I know that they're now called UAPs, but I will forever refer to them as UFOs. I almost forgot to talk about my tea again. Okay, so I have a new tea. It's by Bigelow and it is ginger peach turmeric. And it's really good. I highly recommend if you love ginger tea. And then in this mug, I have just a huge cup of Earl Grey. Cheers. So one of the reasons that this case is such a big part of Canadian history is because it simply has so much evidence and documentation showing its authenticity. There was actual physical evidence that was readily tested by government officials and labs. There was actual documented physical bodily harm that came from the encounter with the UFO. The RCMP, the RCAF, and the US Air Force all came to the site of where this UFO landed, and we have the actual documentation proving that they were there, what they said, and what they concluded. And perhaps the best piece of evidence, in my opinion anyway, is that the Canadian government 100% acknowledges that this event happened. Like, they did not try to cover it up. They even went so far as to celebrate the event by cementing its memory into a commemorative coin. This is the Falcon Lake incident. So in 1949, a man named Stefan was forced to leave his home country of Poland, and he ended up settling in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Stefan worked as a mechanic, but one of his biggest passions was simply being outdoors and enjoying nature because he was a little bit of an amateur geologist. He loved rocks, minerals, metals, anything that he could find in the earth and dig up. And he actually spent most of his weekends in the country prospecting. And prospecting is basically just the initial stage of mineral exploration, where you go out and you search for valuable mineral deposits. So this is what he was doing outside in the woods that day when he ran into an actual UFO. I think I might be coming down with a cold. I don't know. I think everyone is at this time of year. Okay, so the encounter occurred on the 1967 May long weekend. He had planned to stay in the Falcon Lake area all weekend doing his prospecting, so he rented a room at the Falcon Motel. Now, he left the hotel in early morning hours of May 20th, and since he knew that he was going to be outside alone all day in the woods, he packed a bunch of supplies that he would need: provisions, compass, extra supplies, food, etc. Now, he ended up having some pretty good luck because by the early afternoon, he had actually found this beautiful, large quartz vein, which he had been chipping away at for a few hours. And as he was working away on it, he suddenly noticed that the peaceful atmosphere that had been in nature all around him, it suddenly became interrupted. He didn't know what it was at first, but he definitely noted that his animal instincts or spidey senses were kind of going off. There had been this large flock of geese in the area that were just kind of hanging around, and they had grown used to his presence, and they were just off doing their own peaceful little goose thing, I don't know, when suddenly they started freaking out because something out of nowhere had really scared them. Stefan looked around trying to determine what had suddenly made the geese panic, wondering if there was some sort of predator in the area. And this is where he looked up into the sky and he sees 2 cigar-shaped objects with humps in the center. And these objects, whatever they were descending slowly towards him. And as they got closer to the ground, Stefan noticed that they were lit up with this reddish glow. And as they got closer, he also noted that their shape changed from a cigar shape into a disc shape. One of the objects stopped midair, and it hovered roughly 15 feet above his head for about 3 minutes. Then it ascended back towards the sky, and it left. According to Stefan, as this craft left, its glowing red colors changed to orange, and then into a gray, and then back to this bright orange, just as it disappeared into the clouds. And the scariest thing about this was that for the maneuvers it was making, as well as for its size, it was completely silent. The other object had descended all the way down, and it actually had landed on the rock ledge containing the new quartz vein that he had discovered. So Stefan was a self-proclaimed skeptic. He claimed that up until the date of this encounter, aliens, spacecraft, and UFO technology were never something that he thought about. He was not out there that day looking for this. He was not concerned with aliens whatsoever. So when this thing landed pretty much right beside him, he didn't run away. He wasn't scared. Instead, he was faced with pure curiosity as to what this thing was. And his first thought was that this thing had to be just some sort of experimental craft, probably from the States. It was probably just a secret, off the books, American spaceship constructed right here on Earth. And maybe it had crashed. He did not think that this thing was from space. After it landed, one of the first things that he noted were the lights, which were extremely bright. And it should be noted that Stefan was wearing welding goggles to protect his eyes while chipping away at the metals that he was prospecting. And even with the welding goggles, he said that the lights were too bright to take more than a quick glance at. One of the lights was this intense purple that seemed to be coming from a hole at the top of this craft. And these lights too were so bright that even with the goggles, he could not look directly at them, and their brightness was creating colored spots in his eyesight when he eventually did look away from the craft. As he got a little bit closer, he noted the sound of a very, very small electric motor coming from somewhere inside. Stefan noted that for the size of the ship, the softness of this small motor simply did not make any sense, and he expected the sound to be a lot louder. And the craft not only had these very, very bright lights coming out of it, as well as some sound, but it also had a really strange smell. He noted that bursts of warm air were continually coming from this craft, and he could feel these from where he was sitting and watching it. And these drifts of warm air had a very strong smell of sulfur. Even with all of this, he still did not think that this thing was an alien ship. He believed it to be something from the military, and he searched for identifying markers stating where this thing was from, hoping to see some American or Canadian decals or flags or anything, but there was nothing on the outside. It was completely blank and very clean. And whatever this thing was, and wherever it had come from, it was still so fascinating and unlike anything that he had ever seen before that he wanted to record what he was seeing. And keep in mind, this was in 1967, so he did not have a camera with him. So what he did is he got out a piece of paper and he started sketching it. The ship was sitting on the rock face, not doing anything for about 30 minutes, so he had plenty of time to sketch this very detailed picture. And for anybody just listening, this is what he saw. It was a disc-shaped craft that he estimated to be about 35 feet across. It was 12 feet tall with a dome at the top. It had some sort of checkerboard pattern of circles, which appeared to be possible exhaust holes. There was a hatch that also opened, and I'll get into that in a second. And one of the most distinguishable characteristics that he noted was that the ship had no markings of any kind. Completely blank slate. Now, it was around this time that an even brighter light started emanating from the craft. Again, it was this intense purple light that poured out from an opening that appeared near the top. Stefan had to look away immediately from the pain of this bright light, and once again, it caused these bright colored spots to appear in his vision when he looked away. However, his curiosity still got the better of him, and he decided to get even closer to what was quickly becoming this dangerous craft. And when he did, he could actually hear voices coming from inside of it. So I think this also kind of gives you more information on how quiet the motor was that he was talking about, considering the fact that he could hear voices coming from inside. Stefan said that there were two distinct voices, and one of them had a higher pitch than the other. And though the voices were muffled and he could not make out exactly what they were saying or even what language they were speaking in, they were indeed what he thought to be human voices. So he was pretty sure at this point that it was not being piloted by aliens, and I think that gave him a little boost of confidence because he actually tried to get them to open the door and come outside, and he yelled, quote, "Okay, Yankee boys, are you having trouble? Come on out and we'll see what we can do about it," unquote. And he obviously did not get any response. He did decide to try a few other languages in the hopes that they simply didn't speak English. So he tried talking to them in French, Polish, German, Russian, Italian, and Ukrainian, but still nobody answered him. He then decided to walk right up to the craft, and he got close enough to actually touch it. And it was here where he noticed that the opening at the top from where that purple light had come from was indeed some sort of hatch, and it was open, and he was able to look inside. And he sees this large room of just purely flashing lights, but they're more like beams of different colors, and these lights were just as intense on the eyes, if not more, he said. And he actually had to lower the second protective shield of his welding goggles to even get a quick look at them, but they were still too bright to look directly at. He described this room as a maze of lights shooting across the interior of the craft, and the lights were flashing on and off in these super random patterns that had no coordination, at least that he could see. And aside from this light show, there were no beings, no aliens, no humans, nobody inside that could have belonged to the voices that he knew he heard. He said that the ship's material looked like extremely smooth steel, and there were zero seams anywhere. He looked, and he expected to see some sort of welding seams from where the panels of the ship had been welded together, but the entire outside was completely seamless, which I think is really cool. And it was like the disc had been carved from one solid piece of beautiful, shiny metal. He said the exterior of the ship was definitely made of steel, and it looked so shiny and so clean that it looked like colored glass, with all of the colored lights from inside shining out and reflecting back onto it. And because the hatch was open, he could visibly see a cross-section of the exterior of the ship, and he said that the thickness of its outer wall was about 20 inches. So, kind of interesting reference, the Challenger Deep, which is the small ship that went to the deepest part of the Marianas Trench in 1960, that had only a 5-inch thick steel hull. So it goes to show you just how thick this ship was. I don't know if that's like thick enough to fly at the speed of light, or if thickness would be important for that, but I have a feeling it has something to do with that. It was actually the thickness of the ship that really caught his attention, because though he had been hesitant to reach out and actually touch it up until this point, now it was like he just couldn't help it. And he was actually wearing a welding glove to, again, protect him while he was chipping away at the metals. And even with this welding glove on, he could feel how hot it was. And it was so hot, in fact, that it burned a hole through the glove. Immediately after touching it, 2 panels slid across the open hatch at the top, and then a 3rd panel dropped down from above, and the hatch was completely sealed off. The craft then tilted slightly to the left, and it began spinning counterclockwise, and a searing beam of heat shot out of the exhaust holes and hit Stefan in the front of his body. He was in immediate agony because this beam of heat had actually set his shirt on fire and left him with severe burns. There are photos online of his injuries. I'm obviously not going to post those here, but if you do want to see them, they are very easy to look up. Whatever had come out of that blast was so hot or so laden with chemicals that it actually set his clothes on fire, and it knocked him completely backwards. His chest hair was singed off, and he was left with this checkerboard pattern of scorch marks on his skin, and the pattern, the injury, was the exact same pattern as the formation of exhaust holes on the ship. It was exactly as he had drawn it in his sketch. So by the time he was able to rip his burning shirt off of his body, the ship had already risen above the trees. He watched it change colors the same way that the first ship had done, and then he also saw it change back into the original cigar shape. And after this weird transformation, it disappeared. When I was researching this story, I couldn't help but think about how scared he must have been at this point, because even if he didn't believe in aliens, he's all alone in the woods. He's now severely injured, and he has no idea what he has just witnessed or if this thing is coming back. However, he managed to stay composed, and he walked back to the area where he had first seen the ship, and he collected his things. Interestingly, he noted right away that his compass was no longer working properly. He said the needle just started spinning and spinning out of control, even though it had been working perfectly fine earlier in the day. Now, only minutes later, Stefan felt extremely nauseous. He threw up, he developed a massive headache, he broke into a sweat, and he had severe pain in his abdomen from the burns. And also, pink and red colored dots started appearing in his vision again. He also had an intense burning on his chest, accompanied by the burning in his abdomen. And all of a sudden, he was just so sick that he was fighting to stay conscious. Impressively, he did manage to stay calm, knowing that he had to get back into town for medical attention. So he started making his way out of the woods. And as he's walking, his symptoms intensify, and he is vomiting so frequently that he actually starts to vomit up bile. He was in really, really bad shape, and he got so disoriented that he was unable to follow the path that he knew so well. Plus, his compass was no longer working, so he had to make his best guess on which direction to head in. He did get lost, and it took him 9 hours to finally make his way out of the woods and get back to the highway. However, he was obviously really far from his hotel and from any human contact. Now, this part is crazy because an RCMP officer was driving down the highway at the time, and he tried to flag him down, but this officer completely ignored him and kept driving. And then he ran into another police officer a little ways down the road, and this one ended up stopping, and Stefan tells him what had just happened to him, what he had witnessed, and obviously he needed medical attention. And apparently this officer also ignored him and refused him assistance. And I believe he assumed that Stefan was simply drunk, and he told him that he had more important duties to attend to. And oh God, poor Stefan. He was even more sick at this point, and he now believed that he was possibly experiencing radiation poisoning from the craft. He finally made it back to the Falcon Lake Motel, where he was able to call for help, and he got transferred to the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg. Now here, he was treated for 1st and 2nd degree burns to his chest and his abdomen. This is a pug blanket, by the way. It has a giant picture of Pootie on it. When the doctor who treated him asked him how he had gotten these weird marks on his skin, Stefan lied, and he said that they were from the exhaust of an airplane, not wanting to worry or panic his family and his wife, but also in fear of how people would simply react to this crazy story. The hospital confirmed that he was indeed badly burned, but they said it wasn't radiation, which he had been really worried about at that point. They concluded that it was actually some sort of chemical burn, and although he was tested for radiation poisoning, those results came back negative. However, and this was pretty interesting, his symptoms were actually associated with possible exposure to radiation. Now, after he was released from the hospital, the nausea, the severe headaches, the bad vision, all of the symptoms associated with the craft worsened, and these were long-lasting symptoms. He hadn't eaten in days since the event, and he had lost upwards of 13 pounds. Any attempt at eating or drinking I had to let you hear that. Yeah, so any attempt at eating or drinking resulted in pretty much immediate vomiting. Also, the burns in his abdomen suddenly worsened, which was probably the weirdest part. Just as they were starting to heal, they would become outward sores that protruded outwards and got worse and worse. And no doctors or specialists could figure out what these things were and why they were not going away. Now, another interesting note was that in the hospital, and multiple people were witness to this, apparently Stefan reeked of sulfur. His son claims to have smelled the strong odor as well, and he said that it filled the room when he went to visit his dad in the hospital. The smell of sulfur seemed to be seeping out of his pores, and it lasted a really long time, even after returning home. He would walk around the house, and anywhere his father had been, it was perfumed with a stench of sulfur and a burning motor, as if the smell was literally coming from within Stefan. So as I mentioned earlier, Stefan didn't tell the truth about what he actually encountered that day and where his burns had actually come from. However, quickly after his release from the hospital, he saw it as his duty to report this event to the world, no matter how hard it was going to be and how much he knew he was going to be ridiculed. Whatever this ship was, he saw it as clearly a huge secret being kept from the world, and since it had done so much physical harm to him, he thought that it was something dangerous and the world had a right to know about it. Now, as his family explained, Stefan had been a Polish soldier before the war, and as a veteran, he had a very strong drive to divulge this secretive and possibly dangerous information to the people who deserved to know about it. This was the only reason that he ended up contacting the media about it in the first place, not really knowing where else to turn, not really having anywhere else to turn to. So he invited a reporter from the Winnipeg Tribune, and he told her everything that had happened on the day that he saw this craft. And the interesting part is how after this interview, after it went public, the speed at which the police, the army, and the Air Force descended upon this area to investigate it. It was wild. Locals from Falcon Lake stated that at the golf course there, an Air Force chopper landed with a large crew of soldiers and RCMP officers, and the next day a helicopter from the Canadian Army joined them. In addition to the air, there were also teams on the ground heavily investigating the area. As stated by the owner of the Falcon Motel, some, quote, very official looking folks started gathering in the hotel lounge, unquote. And people say these were like Men in Black, the Men in Black. When he asked where they were from, one of the men simply stated that they were from NASA. And apparently another two very important groups of people had gathered in this little area of Canada. Members from the American group called ARPO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and also the head of the UFO project for the United States government. But the problem that they ran into was that they could not locate the exact site of the actual landing. So, almost a month later, on June 30th, after Stefan had recovered well enough to start going outside again, he and a friend went back out there on their own, and he was easily able to locate the prospecting site, and he knew that he was in the right spot because he found all of his personal items that he had abandoned there when he'd gotten sick. Like, he found his burnt shirt that he had ripped off when it caught on fire. He found his hat, which had also been burnt. He had left some steel tape. He'd left the welding goggles and his burnt glove. He ended up taking all of it home as evidence to support his story. I believe it was his friend who convinced Stefan to send these items to a lab in order to have them tested for radiation, and the results of these things, they came back as being highly radioactive. So I'm not 100% sure if the investigations were still ongoing or if they were simply reopened because Stefan had relocated the site. But after the July 27th radiation report showed up, RCMP visited with Stefan and they basically asked him, "Can you please take us out to the site?" And he agreed, and he took them right out there to the rock ledge where the craft had landed. And when they get out there, police start testing for traces of radiation. And the really interesting part is that they find radiation coming from the center of the rock ledge where the craft had landed, but they find no traces on the outer perimeter of the same ledge, nor do they find radiation on the moss or on the grass below the rock. So riddle me that. How does that work? So within days after this happening, large teams of investigators from the US, the RCMP, as well as the Royal Canadian Air Force came to the site to measure it, to take soil samples, as well as do further radiation checks. And they found that radiation levels were so high that the Canadian government temporarily thought about closing Whiteshell Provincial Park. They wanted to stop people from gaining access to the Falcon Lake area because of serious health concerns. However, they soon discovered that the radiation that they were picking up on was from a huge vein of radium that was running through the entire area, which gave the radiation the appearance of something that was naturally occurring. But there's a lot of speculation that that was simply some sort of cover-up because there were a lot of not so natural things happening to Stefan. So for one, his burns did heal and the physical sickness symptoms did end up going away. But here's the weird part. Every 3 months, these burns would return in the exact same spot and they would completely flare up again, just bright red and burning with intense pain. And he would get sick all over again with nausea, vomiting, and serious headaches. And then out of nowhere, the burns would heal, 3 months would pass, and then the burns would come back again full circle, and the whole cycle with the sickness would restart. And this went on for years and years, and no doctor could figure out why this was happening or what sort of illness he had. So I will put this on the screen. And what it is a pretty interesting photo of the original document that was sent to the National Research Council through the Canadian Forces headquarters. It is a teletype, and it was stamped with the word priority on the top of it. And it explains in detail the events of the encounter with this UFO. And this document states that on May 23rd, 1967, 2 objects on ground, approximately 35 to 40 feet in diameter, 8 feet high, saucer-shaped, color of unpolished steel on ground, and changing to heated metal color on departure. Excess of 1/2 hour, Mr. Mahalik observed the 2 UFOs from a short distance for 1/2 hour and observed one depart vertically and head south. He went to the remaining one, observing an open door with a violet light preventing him from seeing inside. As he approached, he could hear a whirring sound and indistinguishable voices coming from within. Upon touching the object with his gloved hand, his glove burned. The door closed, and the object started rotating counterclockwise, then departed vertically, also heading south. His shirt was burned from the exhaust panels on the outer edge, and he required medical treatments for burns on his stomach. He has lost 12 pounds since, as he has been unable to eat. While he was approaching, he could smell what he relates to us as an electrical fire. The noise increased in pitch to a high whine on takeoff. I have a picture of this site that was taken by the investigators at the time, and then I have another of the site as it was a few years ago. And it's pretty cool because it shows the actual quartz vein that Stefan was prospecting the day of the sighting, and it shows the actual rock ledge where the ship landed. I also have a picture of the radioactive reports, and this is from the National Archives of the Canadian National Forces Operations Center. And the samples of soil and the rocks that were taken by investigators at the site, they were sent to these people, and this is what they came back with. Analyses of samples from Falcon Lake incident. Samples sent by RCMP to Dr. A.H. Booth, National Health and Welfare for radioactivity check. The report from Dr. Booth indicates a radiation value of 0.3 microcuries in the soil sample. Dr. Booth reports that the radiation is from a radium source and is a possible serious health hazard. He is sending an investigator to Falcon Lake area. The radiation levels were so high that Manitoba Mines and Natural Resources were debating whether or not to close Falcon Lake that summer due to public danger. So tell me why they were debating shutting an entire lake down if it was simply a naturally occurring vein running under the ground. And how had they not picked up on this before this incident? It's fun to wonder if this really was like a naturally occurring level of radiation, or if it was just some sort of cover-up. With all of the current UFO stuff and people testifying in front of Congress that UFOs from outside Earth are absolutely real, like, you have to wonder what was really going on in this case. Like, did Stefan truly touch a spaceship that was not from our planet? I personally believe that he did, and I think that in 1967 it would have been something that could have caused some serious panic and chaos, and people wanted to shove this under the rug as fast as they could, and that was what they did. So there is another report from the RCMP in regards to not only the soil samples, but also the items belonging to Stefan that they had tested, and this included the welding goggles. This report stated that special labels were needed for sending these items because the radiation was simply so high. They couldn't be sent legally by mail without these special labels. And that report said, enclosed, please find all exhibits forwarded to this laboratory on July 18th, 1967. Mr. S. Hunt of the Radiation Protective Division will supply you with the necessary shipping labels since the radiation level in the soil sample precludes shipping by mail. So that not only included the welding goggles, but also a soil sample as well as the shirt that Stefan had ripped off. They were covered in radiation and they needed special shipping labels to be legally sent in the mail. So again, riddle me how a naturally occurring radium vein in the ground could cover his shirt, his welding goggles, and the soil in radiation. I don't know. If you know, leave it in the comments. Over the May long weekend of the following year, Stefan and a friend once again made the trek back out to the site. And this was pretty much in memory of the event and everything that he had been through and his recovery process. Now, they started digging around in the natural cracks of the rock ledge where the ship had landed, and they ended up finding pieces of radioactive silver, and a lot of them. And these pieces were in all different shapes and sizes. Like, some of them were long and thin, and some are just these little tiny pebbles. And these pieces of silver were described as having no business being out there in nature. They did not look naturally formed in any way, shape, or form. And even a year after the encounter, they were still highly radioactive. And this is fascinating because the University of Manitoba was able to keep one of these pieces of silver, and still today, apparently it is still highly radioactive, which is so cool. One of the most interesting parts about this case is the fact that the United States and Canada came to two completely conflicting conclusions about what this case was and what Stefan Michalek witnessed that day. There is a report by the U.S. Air Force giving their conclusion of the events at Falcon Lake, and it clearly states their skepticism in regards to this being an alien ship. And the important thing to keep in mind is that not once did Stefan claim that he saw an alien ship. Like, the entire time, he believed that the ship that he encountered was something built by some country's Air Force. And in this report, the U.S. Air Force does not deny that Stefan saw something that day, but strangely, they instantly jumped to the conclusion that it was not an alien ship. This is what the report said. If the reported experience was physically real, it would show the existence of alien flying vehicles in our environment. Attempts to establish the reality of the event revealed many inconsistencies and incongruities in the case. Developments subsequent to the field investigation have not altered the initial conclusion that this case does not offer probative information regarding unconventional craft. Now, in comparison, this was what the RCMP's conclusion stated. Neither the DND nor the RCMP investigation teams were able to provide evidence which would dispute Mr. Michalek's story. Although the investigation has been completed, a satisfactory explanation or conclusion is still lacking. That was it. That was all they had to say. And it's just so interesting how the American side said that this event was nothing, while the Canadian side kind of said, wait a minute, we don't have any evidence that it was nothing. Like, we have no idea what happened here. So it's just like, how did two agencies, the U.S. Air Force and the RCMP, especially since they had been working together, how did they come up with such different conclusions? What the heck happened? A lot of people say that for whatever reason, the U.S. wanted to just brush this case under the rug as fast as possible, whereas Canada basically said, we don't know what happened, but we're gonna celebrate it, which is pretty darn cool. And yeah, as I said, like, I thought this would be a really cool case because all of the neat things that are coming out recently with, you know, like really high level, is it pilots, and I don't know who they are, but they're coming out and testifying in front of Congress that UFOs are absolutely real and UFO technology is here and they've witnessed it. So it really makes you wonder, like, how many cases where people have seen actual UFOs, maybe even aliens themselves, how many times have they been discredited when they were actually real? I 100% believe in aliens. I think they've been here. I think they've been here for a long time, and I personally believe this story. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your opinions. Let me know if you have any suggestions for the next video. It could be ghost stories or hauntings or more alien stuff. Doesn't matter. I'd love to hear it. And other than that, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. It would help me out a lot. Leave a comment down below and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And myself, Pootie, and Dexter will see you soon. Bye.